All right, guys. All right, guys, this week we're going to cover chapter 13 in your book, which goes over a lot of content, so we have quite a bit to get through today. So if you guys have any questions or anything, save them till the end. I'll try to set aside a few minutes at the end here to go over any questions you guys might have. This will be the last chapter review of the semester. So if you guys have any questions after today, make sure to shoot me an email. We can still set up individual Zoom meetings if you guys want to talk about content or assignments or your upcoming final exam or anything else. Whew, excuse me. All right, guys. All right, so we need to talk about the concept of manifest destiny. Before we get into the big conflicts of the chapter, the Texas independence movement and the US war with Mexico. So we've talked briefly about this concept of manifest destiny in the past. It's this idea that Anglo-Saxon culture, or that specific cultures, has been applied to several different cultures throughout time. But the specific cultures were destined by God to spread their culture and their society to other cultures across the world. Europeans, especially English Protestants, what we would call WASPs, took this concept and applied it to American expansion westward. This concept of manifest destiny is often tied to this idea that civilization follows the sun, that civilization will follow westward, and it's used as a justification to spread Anglo-American WASP culture and society across North America. So this idea starts as a concept of spreading American democracy, spreading capitalism and democracy, expanding our imprint on the continent, whether that be culturally or economically or religiously. But as the 19th century wears on, we see that this becomes more and more of a racially based agenda to spread white Anglo-Saxon race and culture across the country. So what starts off as this sort of driven by political or economic factors, as the 19th century wears on, this idea of manifest destiny is used to justify the subjugation and marginalization of non-whites as white culture moves west. Pardon me, I've been having some bad allergies lately. Okay. So this concept of manifest destiny will be used to justify several of these expansionist principles or these expansionist agendas, both used by American politicians and religious leaders and supporters of slavery, et cetera, et cetera. All right, make sure you check out the painting in your book. It's called American Progress. It's by a very famous 19th century American painter named John Gast. Sort of shows this concept of manifest destiny as it's depicted in an artistic way. There's some very interesting concepts of manifest destiny, and it really sort of illustrates the way Americans perceived white culture and perceived the expansion of white culture across the West. Okay, so we talked about how the early 19th century, we see several smaller independence movements taking place across Central America, Latin America, South America, etc. We talked about how this impacted the Monroe Doctrine, how America's sort of trying to establish its position as a prominent force in the Western Hemisphere. But it's also causing some tensions and some border conflicts between the United States and Mexico. We know that Mexico went through their own independence movement in 1821. And after they gain independence in 1821, we begin this new dichotomy or this new power dynamic between the United States and Mexico. Specifically because Mexico is trying to invite new settlers, new immigrants into their border territories to create sort of a buffer zone against the impeding Lipan Apache and Comanche Native Americans, but also to try to populate these border regions that have really been neglected prior to Mexican independence in 1821. Remember, the Spanish really focused on central Mexico, focused on their larger settlements, and really didn't have a ton of population in their sort of peripheral or border territories. So in this vein, Mexico really wants to promote immigrants coming into what they call Coahuila y Tejas, what is now Texas. We also know at the same time at the beginning of the 19th century, or during this market revolution in the 19th century, that Americans are looking for more and more territory to expand into because of the prevalence of cotton and the importance of cotton to the Southern economy. This is what led to the Indian removal policies in the 1830s under Andrew Jackson. And in that same vein, American farmers, especially cotton cultivators in the South, are looking for new territories to expand into to cultivate cotton because it's so profitable. Because of this, as Santa Anna in Mexico starts to promote American immigrants to colonize and to come into Texas to provide this buffer, the majority of those immigrants, which we'll now call impresarios, will be American cotton farmers that will bring their cotton technologies, their Southern culture into Texas. The largest of these impresarios is a man named Stephen F. Austin, who is granted huge tracts of land to try to inspire other Southern farmers to immigrate into Coahuila y Tejas, to live in Texas and cultivate products which will support the Mexican economy, and also create this buffer zone against these impeding Native American tribes. So these are largely Southern slave owners looking for land to cultivate cotton in. They benefit Mexico because they provide a buffer against the Native Americans. So you have this weird confluence, this very unique confluence of cultures in Texas between impresarios who are basically Anglo-Americans, Southern farmers, Mexican nationals who are often referred to as Tejanos, and then also Comanche, Lipan Apache, Native Americans who are still fighting for access to and sovereignty over their traditional homelands. And also you have these impresarios bringing African-American slaves in to work in their fields. So almost immediately after these impresarios are establishing permanent settlements and really planting roots in Texas, the central authority in Mexico, the central government in Mexico, starts having conflicts with these impresarios because the impresarios want to retain a lot of their cultural identity as American citizens. They didn't want to convert to Catholicism, which was a main point of the Mexican central government. They had to adhere to Mexican laws, which was often difficult. One, for the Mexican central government to enforce so far away from Mexico City, and two, these Tejano or these impresarios really didn't want to adhere to a new set of laws. They still, by and large, considered themselves Americans. As the Mexican government is trying to rein them in, these impresarios, they impose increasingly strict regulations on these impresarios and eventually outlaw slavery for new immigrant families in Texas. This will be a major sticking point as these impresario families rely on slavery to cultivate cotton in their East and Central Texas plantations. They also increase taxes on these impresarios and start to cut off immigration because they don't want Tejas to become too Anglicanized. So this, by the 1830s, is inciting talks of rebellion against the Mexican government. In 1835, Santa Anna tries to send a message to these impresarios and sends a garrison of troops, 4,000 troops or so, up to San Antonio, which was the capital of Coahuila y Tejas. They had already established a mission presidio system in San Antonio. We talked about that system that the Spanish colonies will often have a mission to convert Native Americans, and then a presidio, which is a military fortification to protect that mission. So San Antonio is very much set up in this model of these Spanish peripheral colonies. And of course, the most famous presidio in San Antonio is the Alamo. So this becomes sort of a watershed moment for these impresarios who have never really assimilated into Mexican culture, never really agreed to the parameters of settling in Texas or agreed to the rules that the Mexican government was really trying to impose on them. And so once Mexico decided to restrict new immigrants and outlaw slavery in Texas, they started talking about rebellion. So Sam Houston, who is sort of the de facto leader of these impresarios, orders San Antonio to be abandoned in 1835 because he knows Santa Anna is coming up to sort of make a statement to these Texas impresarios that Mexico still controls Coahuila y Tejas. A group of Texas impresarios or Texas rebels decide to stay in San Antonio to hold their ground and to begin a large-scale rebellion against the Mexican authority. So they make their stand at the Alamo, right? We have the famous Battle of the Alamo, where these Texas impresarios, these Texas rebels, become sort of a figurehead for a larger movement to rebel against the Mexican government. Battle ensues. About 8 Mexicans to every 1 Texan are killed in this battle. It's a very lopsided battle in terms of casualties, about 1,500 Mexican casualties, and all 200 of the Texas rebels that decided to stay are killed at the Alamo. So it's a military defeat for the Texas Rebellion, which is very much in its infancy in 1835, but it's more important for inspiring thousands and thousands of other Texas impresarios to rebel against the Mexican government. So even though it's even though it's a logistical defeat or a military defeat, it's very much a psychological victory. And remember, the Alamo becomes a rallying cry. The rest of the United States is paying very close attention to these events, reporting on these events in newspapers, and it inspires a lot more Texans to join the rebellion and to actually put up a legitimate army to try to challenge Mexican authority in Texas. So Santa Anna is the military leader and president of Mexico. He's elected president in 1833. Santa Anna has sort of a complicated history. He actually fought for the Spanish and tried to put down the Mexican Rebellion in 1821, then switches sides and ends up supporting Agustin Iturbide and supporting the Mexican Revolution, becomes sort of a folk hero after the initial Mexican Revolution. But then he really botches this Texas independence movement. He's very overconfident. Mexico has a much more organized and substantial army than Texas does. This Texas rebellion is sort of being pieced together in 1835. They're trying to get more impresarios to join the process. So the Alamo is very important as a rallying cry to the Texas independence movement. And on the other side, you have Mexico, who's fairly overconfident that they can quickly put down this rebellion. Mexico, however, from 35 to 55, really, is in a period of incredible political turmoil. Mexico has 36 presidents in that 20-year span, from 35 to 55. So because of this rapid exchange of power and exchange of authority, Mexico is very disorganized and has a very difficult time competing on larger international scales economically and militarily. So we won't get too far into the military history of the Texas independence movement, but make sure you guys understand the major figures in the movement: Santa Anna, Sam Houston. Make sure you understand the Battle of the Alamo. The next big battle that you need to know about is the Battle of San Jacinto, which is a great example of Mexico's sort of Mexican overconfidence. There was a very poorly planned attack on San Jacinto, which is basically Goliad, which will eventually become Houston. It's renamed after Sam Houston. But basically, it's a surprise attack on Mexican forces. In San Jacinto, they're very disorganized. Sam Houston leads a brilliant surprise attack, corners the Mexican forces. It's a very short battle, 20-minute battle. 630 Mexican men are killed, 730 are captured, and only 9 Texans are killed. This is a very lopsided victory for the Texas rebels. So it's important because this really turns the tide of the war. These Texas rebels realize that they can win the war. They've captured Santa Anna after the Battle of San Jacinto. And in some sort of shady diplomatic relations, they force Santa Anna to sign the Treaty of Velasco while he is incarcerated, or while he is under the captives of Texas rebels. So the first is signed weeks after the Battle of San Jacinto, but the Mexican government doesn't really want to acknowledge the Treaty of Velasco because it was signed under duress, right? You can't sign a peace treaty or negotiate the end of a war if one of the parties is being held captive by the other. So they sign sort of 2 treaties. They make one public to try to convince leaders around the world that this Texas independence movement is legitimate and that other countries need to recognize the diplomacy or the autonomy of Texas as an independent nation. So a major sticking point in these treaties is what the southern border of Texas will actually be. Under these negotiations, the southern border was negotiated to be at the Nueces River, which is several hundred miles, couple hundred miles north of the Rio Grande, which is the current border between Texas and Mexico. As Texas will establish itself as an independent nation, they'll continuously claim that their border is actually the Rio Grande. So there's a strip in southern Texas that's continuously disputed who it belongs to, whether the strip in between the Rio Grande and the Nueces belongs to Mexico or whether it belongs to Texas. Okay, so the Independent Republic of Texas is very much like any other southern slave state, although it is a independent republic. It's not part of the United States after it gains its independence from Mexico. It supports slavery. It very much supports a southern economic system where slavery is at the center of the economy, right? A slave economy or a slave system. Tejanos, Mexican Americans or Mexican Texans who supported the movement were unfortunately subjected to the same sort of racial marginalizations. They were relegated to sort of a second-class citizenry, even if they did support Texas independence. Of course, they support slavery, and they're very much sort of modeled after these Southern societies and Southern economies. So nationally, the country is paying very close attention to this Texas independence movement. One, politicians fear that this will incite a war with Mexico, especially over this border dispute between the Nueces and the Rio Grande. So you have on one side the war hawks, who are very much territorial expansionists, who are really led by Democrats. And on the other side, you have war doves, many of whom are Whigs, who don't want to further incite war with foreign authorities, with foreign powers. So it becomes a point of contention between the 2 political parties of the time of the 1840s, the Whigs and the Democrats, whether Texas should be annexed into the United States and whether the United States should become involved in this conflict in the South. So on the Texas side, Sam Houston and Texas officials realize that Texas is going to have a very difficult time um, establishing itself as a sovereign nation. It doesn't have any diplomatic ties with any foreign countries. The United States is hesitant to form diplomatic relations because we don't want to piss off Mexico. And so they really don't have anyone to trade with. They don't have a stable economy. They don't have enough population to really compete in the Western Hemisphere. So they almost immediately start looking for annexation into the United States. Because this is such a contentious topic, it's sort of shelved between the Democrats and the Republicans, and we have lines drawn as to who supports annexation and who opposes it. Most Whigs oppose it, most Democrats support it. This is very illustrative of political dynamics in the 1840s. You have a new coalition of Democrats that are territorial expansionists that have taken power by the 1840s, especially by 1844. So this is sort of a departure from these Jacksonian Democrats that we've talked about of the 1830s. But they do have several of the same tenets of these Jacksonian Democrats. They're very much nationalists. They're very much an America First political organization. And they take that a step further to say that we should pursue military takeover to expand our political borders in the United States. Again, the issue of slavery is going to be at the forefront of these debates. Many of these Northern Whigs fear that Southern Democrats are trying to incite war with Mexico or expand our territory just to add power to Southern slave states in Congress. If we take over, Texas and what will eventually be New Mexico, Arizona, California, Nevada, etc., this is more opportunity for Southern slave states to organize and to gain power in the Senate as we annex more and more states into the Union. All right, so this all sort of boils down to the election of 1844. We have Henry Clay running again, who we know is the figurehead of the Whig Party, and he's running against a new Democrat named James Polk. James Polk, in many ways, tries to sort of ride the coattails of Andrew Jackson. He's even nicknamed Little Hickory. You remember Andrew Jackson was nicknamed Old Hickory. This is the era of political nicknames, right? The Little Magician and Old Rough and Ready and the Great Orator and Little Hickory, et cetera, et cetera. So this new expansionist coalition is the group that gets James Polk nominated, and they strongly support annexation. Henry Clay and the Whigs largely disagree with annexation. All right. So December of 45, Texas enters the Union as a slave state. As soon as it's accepted as a state into the Union, Mexico cuts off all diplomatic relations with the United States. And actually, Sam Houston is genius in this period. He knows that Texas will be much more appealing to the United States if they have some diplomatic recognition. So he starts going to Great Britain and asking Great Britain or negotiating with Great Britain to get Great Britain to diplomatically recognize the United States. So politicians in the US know that it'll be much more difficult to control 3 entities in North America, and they don't want Great Britain to have another significant presence in North America. So this really helps those who support annexation get Texas admitted into the Union. So immediately this causes a dispute with Mexico, right? Immediately the Polk administration declares that the Rio Grande is the true southern border of Texas, when really US diplomats and most of the US agreed that the Nueces was actually the southern border of Texas. So Polk sees this as an opportunity to challenge Mexico to incite violence against the United States so that he can get his way and ultimately get his way to go to war with Mexico and try to take over large portions of Mexico to expand the territorial borders of the US. So he sends troops into the disputed territory, south of the Nueces, north of the Rio Grande. He sends a man named Zachary Taylor, who's a Southerner, but a Whig, sort of a complicated politician. He's one of these guys like Andrew Jackson who sort of used his military legacy, as political capital to get elected president, as we'll talk about here in a bit, 48. So Polk sends Taylor to march troops into this disputed territory. He also secretly instructs the U.S. Navy to post up outside of the western states, outside of California, in case war incites. We're ready to fight a two-front war. All right, so this incites war. The U.S. war with Mexico begins. Before going into war, Polk has sort of a empty gesture, offers $30 million to Mexico for all territory north of the Rio Grande, west of New Mexico, and up into what they call Alta California. So Mexico still believes that Nueces is the true border. So when Zachary Taylor and American troops go south of the Nueces, Mexican troops are sent to meet these American forces. Conflict ensues, and this gives Polk the excuse, basically, to go to Congress and say, look, Mexico incited violence against us. We need to declare war against Mexico. And he very famously says, Mexico has invaded our territory and shed American blood on American soil. The speech, the American blood on American soil speech, becomes very popular, very sort of infamous, as more and more Americans are becoming convinced that we need to expand our territory. So this is the first war fought outside of the United States. This is the first war that's largely reported on by the media. This is a very popular war. Americans, we know, are reading more and more news. They are more and more interested in current events. We've talked about the information and communications revolutions that are going on over the first half of the 19th century. And we also have a large opposition movement organized against this war. These are largely the same types of social thinkers that we've discussed when we talked about the transcendentalist movement in the 1830s and 40s, the utopia movements. Many of these are sort of intellectuals, writers, activists, of course, Whig politicians. Abolitionists are very much opposed to the war. Many abolitionists see this as a war of American aggression to expand our territory in an attempt to get new territories that can expand, or that the institution of slavery can be extended into. So you have abolitionists oppose it, writers. Henry David Thoreau is very opposed to it. He actually goes to prison for refusing to pay taxes to support the war. So these war doves are very much these same type of social thinkers, politicians, Whig politicians, et cetera, et cetera. So Clay comes out as very much opposed to this war and sort of leads a charge of younger congressmen and doves who oppose this war to challenge whether we had the authority to incite war against Mexico in the first place. He calls it a war of defensive aggression. Another man who really opposes the war is a young freshman congressman from Illinois named Abraham Lincoln. And Lincoln, in a very famous speech, stands up and challenges Polk to point to the exact spot that American blood was shed on American soil. It's called the Spot Resolution. And this is to expose that Polk knew that he was the one that really incited violence against Mexico, that it wasn't Mexico retaliating, or that it wasn't Mexico instigating the violence, it was them retaliating to American troops being sent to the disputed territory. All right, again, we won't go too much into the actual war or the timeline of battles in the war. But again, Mexico's sparse population and their frontier settlements, especially north of the Rio Grande, really hurt their chances. The United States is just coming off the War of 1812, which taught the United States a lot of lessons in how to organize militarily, how to move troops more efficiently, how to engage in a large-scale war domestically. And also the political turmoil in Mexico makes it very difficult to organize forces against the United States. So it's a pretty lopsided war in favor of the United States. A couple of the most important battles you guys will read about, the Battle of Buena Vista. Santa Anna really experiences a lot of losses, heavy casualties in this battle. It's a month after the Battle of Buena Vista that he assumes the presidency again. Again, that all gets very confusing. In the summer of 47, Winfield Scott takes Veracruz. This is where they start the American march towards Mexico City, which will eventually end the war. By September, he takes Chapultepec, which is the Spanish castle in the middle of Mexico City. Once he takes Chapultepec, he gains control of Mexico City, and they have to begin armistice talks, have to begin talks to end the war. This is also where you get the famous story of the Niños Héroes, which is a very famous story in Mexico about a group of military students that decide to kill themselves, commit suicide, rather than surrender to American forces. So make sure you guys go through the major battles. The book covers a few of them. The PBS Battlefield Timeline is a really good source if you guys are interested in military history. But yeah, so basically after Chapultepec falls in September of 48, they begin armistice talks, and they begin to talk about transfer of territories and what the new territories will look like after armistice or after the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo. So the treaty is signed in February of 48. Mexico surrenders all of the northern provinces that Polk had initially tried to buy for $30 million. Santa Anna resigns after the fall of Mexico City. He actually goes into exile for a few years. His story gets increasingly complicated. They do negotiate the Texas border at the Rio Grande. The United States agrees to pay $15 million in damages to Mexico. So at the end of the day, Mexico's offered $30 million for all of these northern provinces. They refuse. Polk incites war against Mexico. We win the war against Mexico, and then he gives them half of that money after the war is over in damages. Then we turn around and have to buy a small strip of land that begins here in La Union, New Mexico, and goes across southern New Mexico and southern Arizona into Southern California. It's known as the Gadsden Strip. So the Gadsden Purchase, 5 years later in 53, is negotiated actually right here outside of Las Cruces. And that's because the United States wants access to that territory for a transcontinental railroad. And so by 53, all of the territory north of the Rio Grande is transferred to the United States. And this will set the stage to reignite controversy over the institution of slavery and the government's authority to extend the institution of slavery into new territories that the United States is now populating and that are going through this process of admittance into the Union, right? So just like we talked about after the Revolutionary War, the Northwest Ordinance began the process of bringing those 5 states, populating those states until they had enough population to apply for statehood into the Union, annexation processes, et cetera, et cetera. That will now take place in the Southwest. Texas is already part of the Union. California, New Mexico, Arizona, Nevada will begin the process of gaining enough population to apply for statehood. This is going to see a major reemergence of political sectionalism as well, where the region that you're from determines the way you vote. So this is really illustrated, or this is evident at the end of the war immediately, or I'm sorry, during the war in 1846, while the war is still going on. A man named David Wilmot presents the Wilmot Proviso. He's a Democrat from Pennsylvania while the war is still going on. This also shows you how confident the United States is that they're going to win the US war with Mexico. He proposes this during the first year of the war and says, once we win the war, all new territories that we gained in the US war with Mexico, that slavery should be prohibited or banned in all of those new territories. To avoid any future conflict between pro-slavery and anti-slavery political coalitions, let's just restrict the expansion of slavery into any of these new territories. So this is an interesting moment in Congress when Congress can decide whether or not to quell this future controversy before it starts, or what the true motivations of these Southern Democrats to go to war with Mexico truly were. So this is attached to an appropriations bill as a rider to try to sort of sneak it in to Congress as a way, or added to this bill that's appropriating funds to go to war. So this is where we see sectionalism really start to rise again. Whether you're a Democrat or a Republican, if you're from the South, you voted against the proviso. I'm sorry, a Democrat or a Whig, if you're from the South, you voted against the proviso. Whether you're a Democrat or a Whig, if you're from the North, you voted for the proviso. So now we see that Northerners are worried about the potential violence and the potential conflict that's going to escalate over expanding slavery into these new territories. And Southerners very much want these new territories to become slave states so that they increase their power in the Senate. So the Wilmot Proviso fails to pass the Senate. The Senate's dominated by Southerners because Texas added to their power dynamics in the South, tipped the balance of power to more slave states in the Senate. And so we have a new line really drawn between Southerners and Northerners. Even Whigs split between conscious and cotton Whigs. If you're a Whig from the South, you oppose the proviso because you support expanding slavery in the South, and you're known as a cotton Whig. If you're a Whig from the North, you support the proviso, you don't want slavery expanded, you don't want Southern slave states to have more power in Congress, and you're known as a conscious Whig. You also see a lot of Democrats from the North leave the Democratic Party and join Whigs in the North, who after the Kansas-Nebraska Act will reform into a new political party known as the Republicans. David Wilmot himself is a Democrat from Pennsylvania, so this sort of illustrates the division in American politics is much more sectional rather than party affiliated. Hopefully everybody understands that concept. All right, you also have the Free Soil movement pop up. After the US war with Mexico, the Free Soil movement is basically this idea that free white men should have access to free soil, should have access to compete with other farmers, compete with commercial farms by having access to free soil. So it's not exactly an abolitionist movement. It's not exactly an anti-slavery movement, but Free Soilers don't want slavery extended into new territory because they think it hurts white farmers' ability to compete openly on open agricultural markets. If you're a white independent farmer, you won't be able to compete with these huge commercial plantations that have been established in the South. If you're trying to set up your farm in the future, California or Arizona, what have you. So these Free Soilers aren't exactly abolitionists, but they do oppose the expansion of slavery into Western territories. So all of these debates over the government's role in expanding or restricting the expansion or government's role in expanding or restricting slavery into new territories start to form these new political ideas in the 1840s and 1850s. The Free Soilers, Popular Sovereignty Democrats are another sort of coalition of Democrats or faction section of Democrats in the larger Democratic Party. The figurehead for Popular Sovereignty Democrats becomes Stephen Douglas. Stephen Douglas argues that the issue of slavery should be determined by those that live in these territories that are applying for statehood. that it should be institution of slavery, or whether a state should be free or slave, should be left up to the people of the state themselves. They should have popular sovereignty. So people like Lewis Cass, who runs in 48, Stephen Douglas, will support the institution of slavery, but also oppose the federal government's authority to regulate that institution, that it should be determined by individual states. Stephen Douglas is very much a states' rights Democrat. All right, so California becomes the first state in the new territories acquired in the US war with Mexico to apply for statehood. That's because right after the US war with Mexico, in 48, gold is discovered in California. This facilitates a gold rush, a rush of people in 1849 of white Americans, also foreigners and Chinese immigrants and American immigrants mainly, flood into California in 49 to take advantage of this gold rush to try to find gold. That's why they're called the San Francisco 49ers, right? Because in 1849, you have this huge influx of population. San Francisco in 1848 only had 1,000 people. By 1850, it had 35,000 people. So this facilitates immigrants not only looking for gold, but trying to take advantage of these new populations. Chinese immigrants will be a huge portion of these new populations in California. They'll take advantage of new infrastructures in California. They'll be very involved in the laundry business and the food business. So you'll have sort of an interesting mix of cultures in California. This is also very detrimental to the Native American population of California. California has very fertile soil, had very significant Native American populations prior to the US war with Mexico. And as we know, part of this process of manifest destiny is marginalizing those Native Americans, removing them from California, often through military conflict, to try to open up California to white settlers. All right, so as California gains enough people to be annexed into the United States, it applies for statehood in 1849. So there's several problems that need to be solved by Congress that have come out of this US war with Mexico. One is California statehood. Another is the boundary between Texas and what will be the New Mexico and Arizona territories. So the boundary of West Texas, where we are here in El Paso. Part of that is access to the Santa Fe Trail, which is still a very important trading route between Mexico and central New Mexico. Washington, D.C., which is the home of the largest slave market in the United States. Whigs want the slave market, Whigs and abolitionists want the slave market to be closed. It's a very bad look diplomatically for foreigners to see these huge slave markets as they come to visit our nation's capital in Washington, D.C. But on the other side of that, slave states in the South want stronger fugitive slave laws. And the last point of contention is what to do with this massive debt that Texas has accrued during its years as an independent republic. So again, Henry Clay has to become involved in negotiating this, all of these problems, and he puts them together into an omnibus bill known as the Great Compromise of 1850. So he puts all of these issues into one bill and presents it to Congress for them to vote on this one bill that solves all 5 problems. This shows that the Whigs still have significant power within Congress, right? The Great Triumvirate is still very powerful, and Henry Clay still very much represents the Whigs in Congress, or is still very much the figurehead of the party. So Texas would relinquish some land, the Santa Fe Trail, to New Mexico in return for a $10 million debt being assumed by the United States. Slavery in New Mexico, Arizona, eventually Utah and Nevada will be determined by popular sovereignty. DC would abolish the slave trade, and California would be admitted as a free state. in order for these Whigs and abolitionists to get the southern states to agree to admit California as a free state, they had to pass stricter fugitive slave laws. So with these fugitive slave laws, they then decide to deny slaves the right to a trial anywhere in the country, and they made escaped fugitive slaves in the North. Escaped slaves in the North were still considered fugitives even if they were on free territory. So this is sort of a concession given by these Whigs and abolitionists to Southerners in order to get the Omnibus Bill of 50 passed, or in order for them to really agree to have California be a free state. So this quells tensions for a few years, but by 1854, this new territory and the federal government's role in expanding or regulating the institution of slavery rears its head again as more states are applying for statehood just west of Illinois. So those two states are going to be Kansas and Nebraska. This is just west of Illinois, and so a lot of people are paying attention to Stephen Douglas, his input on popular sovereignty. Stephen Douglas also wants Illinois, specifically Chicago, to be a transportation hub in the United States, where trains from all over the country will meet in a hub in Chicago, which will be very good for the economy of Illinois. So he's very much in support of annexing Kansas and Nebraska, believes that Kansas and Nebraska should both be, or should determine the status of slavery based on popular sovereignty. So this is where we see the Whigs sort of last stand against the rising power of pro-slavery and popular sovereignty Democrats in the South. Kansas and Nebraska, or the Kansas-Nebraska Act of 54 passes despite this intense opposition of Whigs and Northern abolitionists. And because of this, many believe that the Whig Party is no longer capable of challenging the power of the Democrats in Congress. So this really leads to the dismantling of the Whig Party after 54, allows Dems to win in 56, the presidency in 56 under Buchanan. And we see from 54 to 60, this new political coalition of former conscious Whigs, of Van Buren Democrats, of Free Soilers, and of Republicans all come together under a new banner, which will be the third American party system now, which is Republicans versus Democrats. So conscious Whigs, Van Buren Democrats, and Free Soilers get together to form the Republican Party. The Democrats are still dominated by pro-slavery, states' rights, and popular sovereignty Democrats that are really still controlled from the South. Okay, so it passes, splits the country. We see major sectionalism after 54. In the elections of 56, we see very significant sectionalism where the North all votes Republican and Whig, the South all votes Democrat. It also brings up the issue of whether Kansas and Nebraska will be admitted as slave or free states, right? They're supposed to be determining their status based on popular sovereignty. So Kansas becomes a battleground for this idea of popular sovereignty. Pro-slavery advocates, people who want Kansas to be a slave state, send what are known as border ruffians into Kansas. They're immigrants that set up plantations and immigrate and bring in slaves in order to promote Kansas as a pro-slavery state. On the other side, you have groups of immigrants that are brought in from the North to settle in Kansas that are known as Jayhawks or Jayhawkers. These are abolitionist immigrants that try to flood into Kansas to promote Kansas as a free state rather than a slave state. One of these very staunch abolitionists, and in many ways a very radical individual, is a man named John Brown. He's a religious fanatic who believes that God has appointed him to fight slavery and to impose abolition across the country. And he takes his son along with several other radical abolitionists, and they go into Kansas and incite violence against pro-slavery border ruffians. They end up dragging 5 men outside of their homes and chopping off their heads, chopping off their hands in these very public displays of abolition or public displays of violence against slave owners. And this erupts into basically a civil war in Kansas itself, which is often referred to as Bleeding Kansas episode or the Kansas Civil War. Eventually about 200 people die. And Kansas is admitted as a free state. It very narrowly avoids slavery, and it is admitted as a free state in '61, just before the Civil War. All right, the last thing we need to talk about is the Dred Scott case. Dred Scott is a slave who sues for his freedom because he's been living in free soil in Illinois for 4 years. He believes he's entitled to his freedom. And this is going to be an opportunity for for the Supreme Court to weigh in on this issue of whether or not the government has authority to regulate the institution of slavery, whether the government has the authority to determine whether slavery can be extended or whether it can be restricted, and also the legal status of slaves and ex-slaves in the American Constitution or in the American system. So in 1850, Missouri courts actually grant Dred Scott his freedom based on this argument that he's lived for 4 years on free soil. 2 years later, the court case is appealed up to the Missouri Supreme Court, where they reversed the decision and they ruled that Dred Scott needs to be returned to his original family and forced back into servitude, forced back into slavery. Scott then appeals to the federal court system, and the appeals go all the way up to the Supreme Court. So the Supreme Court ruling is very important in this escalation of events that will lead to the Civil War. One, they say that slaves as well as free blacks were not considered U.S. citizens and shouldn't be afforded the same rights as U.S. citizens. That's a very important point. 2, rules that Congress has no right to exclude slavery from new territories. That ends the debate about Congress's authority to extend or exclude slavery in new territories. Remember, the Kansas-Nebraska Act basically nullifies the Missouri Compromise, which said no new states north of the 3630 should be able to have slavery in any future states. So that was now declared that the government does not have the authority to carry out restrictions on these new states. It also declares that the Declaration of Independence and Bill of Rights were not intended to be applied to African Americans. So this is very much seen as, by a lot of Northerners, as a conspiracy of Southern Democrats to legalize slavery across the United States, where it's already been abolished north of this Mason-Dixon line. So many see this as the final sort of failure of the Whig Party, that the Whigs had failed to combat popular sovereignty in the Kansas-Nebraska Act. The great accomplishments of Henry Clay during the Compromise of 1820 have all been nullified. Now the government's authority to restrict slavery has been delegitimized or has been ended through the Dred Scott case. And so this is really sort of the beginning of this very staunch division between the North and the South. You'll also read about John Brown's attempt to invade the South, the Harper's Ferry event. We'll talk about that a little more when we get into the actual Civil War next week. You guys will also read about the election of 1860. We'll talk about that next week as well. All right, guys, any questions for me? I'm sorry, I said we talk about that next week, but this is actually our last meeting. So if you guys do have questions about that or the Civil War or the readings from next week, make sure you guys shoot me an email and we'll set up a little meeting. All right, guys. Thanks very much. We'll see you guys, or have a good day, and good luck on everything. Shoot me an email if you guys need anything. All right. Thanks, guys.